Christ. And each of us here this morning comes from different places and different churches that each inhabit unique places. This morning we have urban and suburban churches represented, ex-urban and rural places represented, places that are wealthy and those that struggle. But what unites us all is that all of us are called to bring the fullness of our Christian witness to the place that we find ourselves in. Before Montreal, I lived in England for some time, and I have a clear memory of hearing a bishop there once say, "I want clergy who see themselves as parish priests and not as chaplains to the congregation." What he meant by that was he wanted his clergy to understand themselves as called to serve not just the people who darken the door of the sanctuary on a Sunday morning, but as Christians who are called to relate in the spirit of Christ to all those who live in that particular place, that parish. And that's why we think that congregational ministry, in all the many forms it is represented here today, is so vital to the flourishing of the church. It is through the ministry of Christian congregations that the gospel is brought to neighborhoods and communities across this province. It's when we understand ourselves as called to serve all people who share our places that our witness together will grow. And that's why I'm delighted this morning to welcome the Reverend Dr. Tim Dickow. More than 30 years ago, Tim arrived at Grandview Calvary Baptist Church in the Grandview neighborhood of Vancouver as a new pastor, more or less fresh out of seminary. And at that time, Grandview was aging congregations, and there were ongoing conversations about whether it made sense even to keep going in that building and in that place. More than 30 years later, just a couple of years ago, when Tim stepped back from active pastoral leadership, Grandview was a flourishing congregation, intercultural, multi-generational, and oriented towards serving the diverse and changing people of the Grandview neighborhood. And there were many important aspects that brought that transition about, and we're going to hear lots more about them today. But a fundamental factor in their rejuvenation was the church's decision to deepen its connection with the neighborhood of Grandview and learn to serve its changing people in changing times. Now, Tim and I first met not that long ago in a context quite different from this morning's. And though Tim is a Baptist, I learned that he has many ecumenical leanings and a great openness to diverse expressions of Christianity in its many denominational forms. And after meeting Tim, I read the books that he's written and began to think about ways to bring him to Montreal to share his stories with us here. Our context in Quebec is different than Tim's in Vancouver, but I think we'll learn there's much that unites us in our Christian witness. Before turning things over to Tim, though, I want to say a little bit about how we've structured our time together. In reflecting with Tim and others about where we are as a church right now, it became clear that one important thing that we can worthwhilely spend time doing is to tell stories. It's what Jesus did, after all, and at a time when many of us can feel overwhelmed and burdened by what it means to be church in this time and place, stories can have a way of grounding us, opening up new avenues of exploration and leading us into wonder. With Tim this morning, and then again this afternoon, we're going to hear stories. But we also know that everybody here has stories as well. And so there will be time for us in small groups to think about how our stories intersect with the ones we're hearing today. Some of you have come here today with other people from your congregation, your church. And so when it comes time to spend time together in group discussion, we'll encourage you to gather together with other folks from your church. Many of you, though, here are also here not necessarily representing any congregation or coming from any particular church location. And so we'll invite you to reach out and get to know somebody else here as well and think about how your stories intersect with each other. So telling stories is one thing we want to do today. And the other thing we want to do is hear our stories intersect with each other. No single gathering will ever come up with the magic solution for how we can revitalize Christian witness, and nor should it. But our hope today is that you will meet somebody new in a small group or over a cup of coffee or over lunch and have a chance to share stories and experience to dream together about what's possible for Christian witness in this time. Through story sharing and listening to one another, we hope that all of us will leave here filled with new perspectives, new ideas, and new hope about the great calling we all share. I want to extend a special word of thanks to the Naga Regional Council of the United Church of Canada, the Standing Committee on Mission of the Diocese of Montreal for their financial support of today's event. I want to say thank you to the Church of St. Mark and St. Peter for offering us their space today, and to the staff and the volunteers of this church who have done so much to make us feel welcome here. I want to thank Neil Mancor and Dave Robinson of the Diocese of Montreal and David Rager-Gagnon of the Regional Council for their help in brainstorming about what a gathering like this could look today. And I want to say a big thank you to the folks who work at the college who do so much to make me look good as the front man, notably Heather McCants, Allison Huntley, Emily Stutchbury, and Gerald Melendez, all of whom have contributed ideas and labor to make today happen. And I finally want to thank all of you. I want to thank you for your presence and participation here today on a Saturday morning when there are lots of other things to be doing. And also at a time when we know that Christian witness in this province is not easy. The challenges sometimes can seem overwhelming. But your presence here today is a testament to the wonder of faith and the power of hope in all of our lives. So may we all listen, learn, share, and so be transformed today. Before I turn it over to Tim, let me conclude with a word of prayer. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made. Your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. And Tim, maybe you can come forward and we'll say a prayer for you as well.
Thank you.
And let's pray for Tim, that the words he speaks today may be words of grace and words of hope, and that in this time we share together this day, we may hear God's word in new ways and receive new strength for the journey which we all share in Christ. Amen.
Well, thanks for this welcome, and thanks to Jesse. It's been wonderful to get to know Jesse and really appreciated your encouraging words for all of us, Jesse, this morning. I want to say how good it is to be here. I've already this week had a number of good conversations with people here in Montreal, and just really made me feel welcome and also encouraging to see the kind of conversations people are having about what it means to be the church together. I am also grateful because our youngest son is here doing his PhD at Concordia, and so it's a chance for me to visit him and to be with him, and so that was a great privilege as well. When Jesse sent me the question for the topic of this, it was a little bit like opening your final exam and getting a question going, oh shoot, what am I going to say about this? It's a big question, isn't it? What's next for the church? And I don't know that anybody can really answer that question really effectively, but I agree with Jesse that we need specific stories to spark our imagination, to get us thinking about what could be possible in our context so that we're dreaming together and having these important kinds of conversations. And I want to reiterate what Jesse said, that I really value you being here on a Saturday. And I trust that our presence together today, the Spirit will do something among us. This won't just be a day of learning, but will be a day of transformation for all of us. I trust that. Let me tell you what I want to do with you during my time this morning. And I want to tell parts of our Grandview story, and I want to describe some of the processes we went through, because I think the process is more helpful. As Jesse said, we all are in different contexts. And you're going to have to, hearing this story, you're going to be the ones to contextualize it and to figure out, well, what's transferable, what's useful, what's helpful in our context. And so that'll be your work as you hear this particular story that I tell. And then in the second half this morning, what I want to do is lead you in an exercise where we're going to think creatively about ways that we can move along these trajectories that you'll see up on the walls beside you in your own context. What does it mean to move towards a more radical hospitality? I'll explain a little bit about that, or to more intercultural life together in Christ, towards seeking justice for the least. We'll look at these and talk about these and explore together how we might do that. Before I tell you the Grandview story, though, I want to set the context for some of the reasons we did what we did. And this comes out of a question that I had lived with for many years as pastor, and that is, why is being the church so difficult sometimes? Why is being the church just so darn hard sometimes? Like to try and not just form a people, but form a people that bear witness to the fullness of Christ, who are being transformed together and who are, participating significantly well in the lives of their neighbors, and their neighborhood, and the issues of their neighborhood. Why is that so difficult to get at sometimes? And secondly, why do so many people seem just closed to the gospel, or just uninterested? They're not even closed. They're just not interested. And why is it that we experience so much of that? That was the question that I was grappling with so often. And so in light of that, one of the things that became clear to me as we moved along is that we were up against some significant powers. There were forces at work in our culture that made being the church difficult, and made it difficult for us, any of us, to take God seriously, or take God's action in the world seriously. So these powers, many of them aren't going to strike you as anything revolutionary. I want to take you through them just for 15 minutes or so, particularly talking about the first one, secularism, and then a little bit about these other ones. It's not that I expect you're going to learn a ton about these powers today, but I want you to feel the force of them, and to feel why it is so difficult to live well as communities of Christ followers today. To help us with secularism, I'm going to rely on the work of your own Charles Taylor here from McGill. And if any of you have waded through Charles Taylor's 800-page A Secular Age, it's a good, hard read. I said, good book, 800 pages, no pictures, not a good idea. No, not a good idea not to have any pictures. And so the good news is that I have some really good pictures for you this morning to help explain what he's doing. Charles Taylor, in his book, asks this question: why is it? How did we move, rather, from a condition where in Christendom people lived naively within a theistic construal to one in which all shunt between two stances, in which everyone's construal shows up as such, and in which, moreover, unbelief has become for many the major default option? So he's not saying, back 500 years, everything was rosy, or everybody was devout. That's not at all what he's saying. But back 500 years previously, people lived within a social world that God was a part of, that this was the reality. Now, he says, we've come to a place where everybody's beliefs are contested, and many people, their default option is unbelief. That makes most sense of the world. I want to take you through 4 shifts that Taylor describes. And we're only going to touch on these. If you've read Taylor, this will be just a little review for you. If you've never, this might seem a little bit dense on a Saturday morning, but I think the pictures will help to help us through it. Taylor talks about, first of all, the first shift, he talks about the great disembedding that took place during the 16th, 17th, and the beginning of the 18th century. And he describes 3 movements that we made from what he describes as a porous self to a buffered self, from sacred time to homogeneous time, and from cosmos to a universe. And if you are trying to get all the notes down, don't worry, I'll send the PowerPoint slides to Jesse, and he can distribute them to everybody afterwards. But let me take just a brief moment to explain this. In the Middle Ages, there was a sense that the self is porous. and permeable by outside forces, both benevolent and malevolent forces. And in this enchanted world, spiritual forces reside in objects and places and being. It was enchanted. And as humans, we envisioned ourselves as having porous boundaries too, that with the result that these forces could shape our lives, both in psychic and social, physical ways. And in this spiritually charged milieu, corporate worship was really important. Corporate worship and devotion had both a protective role for all of society, keeping these forces in check, and it connected us to the one who protects us and supports us. So throughout the late Middle Ages, meaning began to shift, though, from the exterior social world to the inner world of the mind. Objects and places still have meaning, but it's the meaning we begin to ascribe to them. And someone like Descartes looms large here. As such, the self becomes less porous. Whoops, I forget, there's the porous self. Should have shown you that picture. And the self becomes less porous and more buffered self, that where these forces, they just bounce off of us. There's no sense that they penetrate us with any great ease. And in this new context, the social role of the church to protect society or to engage the divine mystery becomes less important, and worship starts to become more optional for society. Two related transitions he talks about from the 17th to the 19th centuries, which are about the disenchantment of the world, have to do with space and time. So during the 17th century, there was a sense that we live in a cosmos inhabited by spirit, that there's a meaning to the cosmos and there's a destiny for the cosmos. But as we move forward in that history, there's a sense that we move to what is called a universe with random events and no ultimate meaning. As we begin to, our image of the universe changes. It becomes impersonal without final cause or purpose. And then related to this is a differing view of time, a change in our view of time. And so we move from what Taylor describes as sacred time, where people saw their story within the overall salvific activity of God in the world, and also situated within the church year and the celebration of the church year. And so Taylor has this great line in the book that Good Friday 1998 is closer in a way to the original day of crucifixion than Midsummer's Day 1997, when you live in sacred time, when you live in this sense of being part of Christ's story. Now, however, many people don't find meaning in the sacred story, in the biblical story. And so he says we've moved to what he calls empty, homogeneous time, where all time is uniform and devoid of significance, sacred significance or meaning, filled with a sense of monotonous. I say it's a little bit like Groundhog Day, you know, the movie Groundhog Day. You wake up and it's just another day the same. Taylor groups all these transitions together as part of what he calls this great disembedding. From a time when humans were embedded within a divine order, we moved to a time where persons were disembedded in that divine order. And after this time, humans are prone to replace God at the center of reality. And that's going to be part of the story of all of these shifts. With the onset of what Taylor described as the age of mobilization in the 1800s, when industry and business and new associations, volunteer organizations all explode in quantity, there's this growing sense that we construct reality. Oops, I'm going to miss that one. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. How do I get back here? I want to go back. How do I go? Oh, there. Great. Okay, now I'm on the right track. Oh, okay, sorry. There. There's Taylor. So there's this sense that we're no longer situated within divine reality, and this constructivist view of reality results in the perception any meaning is to be discovered in us. It's not out there. And so transcendent meaning starts to become elusive. These shifts start to explain why it is that God can feel absent from our world and lives. And these shifts lead to what Taylor describes as living in an immanent frame, where the transcendent frame, ultimate meaning and divine action, they're hard for them to penetrate into our world. And even though he says, but still we're haunted by transcendence. There's still these moments where people have some sense that there's got to be something more than this, but it's hard for that to penetrate into our world. Well, that's one shift, the disembedding of society within a divine order. Another shift is the move from theism to deism, from this sense that God not only brings life into being, but that God is involved in the world, to a God who kind of gets things started and then steps back out of the picture. One of the ironic twists in this story is that the reformers felt that they were so committed to working out the kingdom of God in everyday life that they became very good at organizing society. And one of the ironies that Taylor describes is how in places like Geneva, they became such good managers that, in a sense, over time, Taylor says they kind of managed God right out of the picture in that work. And there's a sense that that grace becomes less necessary because we can make a lot of this happen ourselves. Taylor also describes during this time that the reality that Christianity became what he describes as excarnational, where it was less about the body and the place, and more it became about drifting away towards what goes on in our heads and minds as what is important. And again, we're going to see some of the reason this is helpful to this material is it helps us to see why common practice and taking formation seriously is going to be so important for the church as we move forward into the future in the secular age. There's other pushes towards deism, including certain kinds, expressions of Calvinist kind of thought that make what we do seem less necessary or less important to our eternal destiny. And so why keep these standards? And so there's other theological moves that are made within these years that contribute to this shift. So if one shift is towards order that will eventually result in a focus on science and technology as a way to try and bring meaning, at least into this immanent frame that Taylor describes. Another pathway that we go is towards what he calls the age of authenticity. And in this move, this starts kind of during the Romantic period and the 19th century onward, and it really enlivens the arts as a site for securing meaning. And in the 20th century, the focus on art as creating and the importance of personal expression combines with a number of other factors such as consumerism, mobility, so forth. We're going to talk about some of those, and particularly the sexual revolution in the 60s, resulting in changing social patterns. Now, these shifts aren't all bad by any means. We can say lots of good, right, has come out of these shifts in many of these areas. But at the same time, it's also resulted in the erosion of people belonging to place and being in place. And Taylor names this age of authenticity as one where each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it's important to find and live out one's own life as against surrendering to conformity with the model imposed on us from outside by society of the previous generation or religious or political identity. So in this kind of milieu, anything that's seen as, quote, restricting our freedom, our autonomy, is going to be viewed with suspicion. And freedom, again, kind of shifts in its meaning from freedom from oppression or stereotypes to just any constraint. We have to be free of any constraints. And in this kind of age, the church's vision of the good life often becomes seen that way, doesn't it? As something that restricts my freedom rather than the pursuits of what we're created for as humans. One last shift I'm going to describe that Taylor discusses. And this is what he just says we're in right now, the Nova effect. And he says that we've mushroomed all over the place worldviews. And so there's very little one worldview that can unite many people together in this day and age. And the challenge is that people, pick pieces from every little worldview or religion or elsewhere, not feeling much need to connect these beliefs within a community. As one former member from our church who stepped away said to me afterwards, "Why would I go to church to be told what to believe?" And I didn't think that was what we were doing exactly, but that was her experience and thought at that time. You can see how the church having authority in this culture and context is just undercut, isn't it? And so if we come from a place of authority, it's unlikely to be received well in the public sphere. Getting depressed yet? You thought, why did I come on a Saturday morning just to feel kind of depressed about all this? I think it's really important to understand some of these forces we're up against, because otherwise we're going to be co-opted by them. We're going to easily slip into this ourselves, because let's be honest, we can all live as functional atheists fairly easy. It's easy in our culture to function as though God's not doing anything, and that God's not active in our world by God's own Spirit. And so these things touch our lives too. It's not just out there, they touch us, each and every one of us. I think this is one of the great losses that Taylor describes in this story, is the loss of the sense of God's action and agency in the world. Even if people believe in God, sense that God's out there, not really involved in our lives, rather than this incredible vision we find in the story of the Bible, who is intimately involved in each of our lives, intimately caring for people in the world, and the Spirit who groans along with creation in its suffering. Very different vision from the way that we perceive God in our culture. So that's a little bit of Taylor. Let me just name quickly some of these other powers that we are up against. One of them is autonomy. And any pastor or clergy person here today probably curses at the word autonomy by now, because it's just, it's so hard to gather people for the long term. It feels like you just get things together and then people move away and they're doing their own thing, and it's hard to gather people to be a community together. Many reasons for autonomy. I've listed some up on the board there. You can probably all add to that list reasons that or ways that plays out in your own community. Related to autonomy is consumerism. Humans have always consumed things. Again, these all have an element of truth in them, don't they? And of course, we know that Christ wants to and will reconcile all things together. And so these powers will eventually find their rightful place in creation. But the sense of, I try and distinguish autonomy from personhood, which is a good thing, right? We all need to differentiate our personhood, different from autonomy. Same way with consumerism. We're created to enjoy God's creation, right? To enjoy the world. And so that's not the problem here. The problem is when we're seduced into turning everything into a commodity, or when we're tempted to pursue the goods life versus the good life, or where the poor get viewed as bad consumers and are shamed for that reason. I think number 7 on that list is the one that's touched me the most, is that consumerism is less about desiring the material as it is about desiring the next thing. And you see that no more clearly than with our phones. Like, you just get a phone and then it feels like 6 months later it's out of date, right? And then we think, oh, we got to have the next one or we won't be kind of on the mark. And that's what consumerism does to it. It takes away our ability to actually enjoy what's in front of us and to push us on to the next thing as the thing that will finally satisfy us. Economic globalization, I'm not going to say much about that, just to say I think there's been so much good with globalization, but there's on the economic side, it's really in many ways an amplification of autonomy and consumerism. Racism really been influenced by Yale scholar Willie James Jennings in his book, The Christian Imagination, brilliant book, describes how colonialism has really separated us from both people and land. And he calls us, we have to take place seriously if we're going to overcome racism, if we're going to deal with our neighbor next door to us and really have the kinds of conversations and relationships that lead to solidarity together. Inequality, again, no surprise that we've named this. This is Thomas Piketty, if you've read his book on capital in the 21st century. It's really an argument over 200 years study showing how inequality is growing in the world and likely will, because incomes can't keep up with the capital gain. And so it's the wealth is really becoming disparate in our world. And I'm struck by someone like Chrysostom at the bottom there, who really pushes hard on issues like this. And the church fathers and mothers often did push a lot harder, I think, than we do in our churches today to challenge inequality in our world. Our son is doing his PhD on climate science. He actually studied in his undergrad thesis, he studied outdoor ice rinks in Montreal to see how global warming was impacting the ability to use these ice rinks and how they were closed more often, and had kind of a social and scientific connection that he got interviewed by CBC and some other things and kind of got people's attention a little bit. We need more things that get our attention here, don't we? Because unless we're going to start addressing this issue as the world, we're going to be facing certain results that are already, some of them, inevitable. And again, Rowan Williams, as per usual, states so well, our present ecological crisis, the biggest single practical threat to our human existence in the middle to long term, has, religious people would say, a great deal to do with our failure to think of the world as existing in relation to the mystery of God, not just as a huge warehouse of stuff to be used for our inconvenience. The problem with these powers is that not only can they co-opt us, but they tempt us towards idolatry, which the Bible sees as the age-old human dilemma. And in his book, Migration of the Holy, Catholic theologian William Kavanaugh contends that we're not so much buffered from transcendence as we are tempted to search for the transcendent within the immanent. And he argues that the practices of conferring allegiance and worship have not disappeared, but have migrated from God and the church to the market, the state, and the ever-present self. We get co-opted by these, don't we? And we will need to repent of our idolatries as the church. I'm really like the vision that Paul Ricoeur came up with, the difference between icons and idols. He says the problem is not that we care about creation or appreciate creation. Obviously, that's really important, and one another. The problem is when, he says, our gaze stops at a particular object and never goes further towards the one who is the giver and gift of life. And so icons lead us from the place, the person or place we are looking at, towards giving thanks to the Creator. Idols, we get stuck there, and that becomes our search for meaning. Okay. Oops. How are you feeling as you hear these description of these powers? Let's just hear a few words. How are you feeling as you hear the description of these? Just shout them out. Dismayed. Overwhelmed. Depressed. Awesome for Saturday. Just what we needed. Yeah. What's that? Quagmire. Yeah. Exhausted. Helpless. All right. Well, that's a good segue. I feel the weight of these powers too, and but I do think exactly right. I want to turn us just for a brief moment to Paul's letter to the Colossians, because just let me before that, let me give two other responses that I think we can easily make, but I don't think are the way forward for the church. And so the first one is giving in to these powers. And so, in North America, we've ended up creating plenty of churches that ask for a little more than 2 hours on a Sunday and a small portion of a person's income in exchange for an entertaining style of worship that appeals to consumerist and autonomous impulses, but fails to name these powers as idols or call people to a sacrificial pursuit of and participation in God's kingdom of peace and justice. Look, attractional churches have we all want our churches to be attractive. I don't think that's the issue, really. The issue is that just being a good church is not going to bring people anymore to church, is it? It's not the reality we live in what Taylor describes here. I don't know of any church, perhaps with a few churches really connecting well with new immigrants to the country. I don't know of any church in Canada that is growing rapidly through conversion growth. Do you? You know any church in Canada that's growing rapidly through conversion growth right now? I don't think that's the context we're in. That's not to say that can't change. The Spirit of God might do something in the next while, but things change rapidly. And it could be because we're really facing some difficult problems that people respond and see the good news of Christ again. But the reality is that that's the context we're in. So one of the ways we could try and give into these powers and just create churches that even are successful in bringing people together, but don't really impact the world in the way that the gospel envisions. And so I don't think that's the answer. I'm really glad there are some good attractional churches in every city, and we need churches that are growing however they're growing. Let's be glad for them. At the same time, we need to think a little bit more broader about how to be the church today. The other thing we can do is give up. And this is what I see a lot of going on around the country, is people giving up on being the church and saying, well, what's the use? In the face of these powers, what does the church have to offer really in when you look at these massive forces at work in our culture? I want to argue that the way forward is the way that the church has been called since its beginning, and which was reflected in that first song that Jesse led us in, the way of death and resurrection. I want to turn just briefly to Paul's letter to the Colossians. It really strikes me reading that letter that Paul, writing from prison no less, to this small community of believers in the city of Colossae, writes to them with what we would consider vaunted language of the great role they play in what God is doing through the gospel in the world. And there's no sense from Paul that he's writing that he himself is feeling triumphant or strong, or more likely he's feeling pretty humble and weak. And nonetheless, he declares that the gospel is bearing fruit around the world, that it has power, that through Christ, God is reconciling all things to God's own self. That's quite a statement in that context. And through Christ, God is forming a people who are to go through this process of death and resurrection, putting to death the things that don't reflect the way of God and the image of God in the world, and rising anew to bear witness to the kind of life that reflects the goodness and love of God. And Paul says that this all happens ironically through Christ being crucified. He says, which, was a sign of Roman triumph over their enemies. Ironically, this was God's triumph over the evil and oppression and injustice and sin that destroys God's own creation and liberates us to live into God's purposes for our lives. Christ has defeated the powers, and God will defeat the powers one day when all things are made new and all things, creation itself, is renewed. Christ is the head, Paul says, over every power and authority, greater than the power of the empire, greater than the power of racism, greater than the power of autonomy. Christ has defeated those powers and is in the practice right now of reconciling all things to God's own self, so that we might take up our true vocation as God's image bearers in the world. That's a real hope. That's not just a glass half full optimism. And I really think it's helpful to distinguish between optimism and hope. Optimism is just kind of a way of looking at the world that some people have and others don't. Hope is based on something. And our hope here is based on the reality that God has overcome the powers that would destroy our lives, and that we can trust that the Spirit is at work through our churches and in our personal lives to bring new life and to help us confront and resist these forces that could easily overwhelm us. Okay, that's all the preaching I'm doing today, but I had to get that little bit in there. Just the religious nuns by year, but some of you saw the statistics came out just this week about the increase in the nuns as well. Now I'm going to shift and talk to you about our story at Grandview, and then have a little bit of discussion time with you about that, to give you a chance to ask questions of our story, and then I'm going to turn it to you in small groups, and we're going to just ask the question: what is the spark for thinking about your own mission as a church where you are? And again, not that you'll do the same things, but what does it spark in your own thinking? I certainly hope you won't make all the mistakes that we did, that's for sure. So let me tell you first about, before I had a slide I think I failed to put in here, about the first 10 years. This is the second 10 years, and but let me tell you about the first 10 years. When I came to Grandview, I was like a lot of churches, as Jesse said. People were older. The church had disconnected from the neighborhood. People had moved away. And they invited me to do a community study. I was part of our denomination's church renewal committee. And so we were trying to think of a project that could help the church to reconnect a little bit with the neighborhood. So what I didn't find out till I was there 3 months ago, they'd actually decided to quit, but nobody told me. Anyways, so I was given the job of going around the neighborhood and talking to people and say, what's going on in this neighborhood? What are the needs of the neighborhood? How could a church help? And I went and I talked to whoever I could, and politicians, residents, teachers, social workers, whoever I could, and really got to know people. It was looking back in retrospect, that 6 months was such a gift to me as a pastor, to be able to develop those relationships in the neighborhood. Then I tried to help the people that were part of the church, which is about 50 people, to try and understand how the neighborhood had changed, who was living there, and so forth. These are things that many people have now done. And talking with some folks here in Montreal, done similar things. Just exegeting your neighborhoods become part of what we do to understand what's going on in our neighborhoods. Well, I became the pastor 6 months after that. The pastor who had been there 20 years, served faithfully the community, retired. And slowly we started to work away at things. And we started a few things. We started some tutoring with school students. We started a parents group. That started when I was at the park one night with we have 3 adult sons, and our first son was 6 months when we were at Grandview. And I said to a woman who was also there with son, and got to know her, and we had been getting to know each other. And I saw her at the park there and started talking to her. And I said, she said, Tim, there's nothing for parents in this neighborhood. There's no place to go. And I said, well, man, we've got this hall at the church. We could do something there. And so we started this parents group. My wife, Mary, led the group, and I did the childcare. At one point, we had 10 boys that I was taking care of, and I would take them to the park, and I figured if I came back with 9, I was feeling pretty good about how things went. This was before the days of liability policy, right? So we were free for that. There significant things happened in that parents group. There was a woman who'd been sexually abused by clergy who told that story and married, and the other Christian in the group said, "We are so sorry that this happened," apologized in tears, and were held. That was the first woman that I baptized and did her her wedding. We also Halloween made me think of the story that we were close to Halloween. We went trick-or-treating. This was a few years into my time at Grandview. And we slowly and formally met up with these parents walking around, not by intention, just by walking through the neighborhood. We all lived in the neighborhood. And so we met up and we all went down to the local community center together where they were having an event. And Doug Sue, the executive director, one of the people I'd met in my 6 months, called me over and said, "Tim, who's that group that you're with?" I said, "Oh, we started a parents group at the church, and we just ran into each other and we're hanging out together." He says, "Well, look around. There's like 300 people here. You're the only group." And he says, "Whatever you're doing there, you better keep at it." And so he was seeing something that even we were struggling to see, community forming in that way, and was really important for us at that time. We went through a visioning process in my 4th year, and that was important to the church. Just to say a couple words about that, I preached through something from the Bible, I'm sure, during the fall about rebuilding vision. And then we met in small groups for 6 weeks, talking about where God has been at work, what's happening now, where we thought God was leading us. And then we brought that all back to a Sunday morning. We talked about it. And then we did something significant in retrospect. We interviewed every person or family, them individually. And that was really significant because it said, all of you have something to contribute to this visioning process. Secondly, we all have an accountability to participate in what's unfolding here. We eventually had got a vision statement that was far too long, and that's another learning from that experience. I don't even remember that statement. There were 2 things in it that were significant. One was we committed to the neighborhood, to be a part of the neighborhood, to seek its well-being. And the other thing is we committed to being a community of diversity, reflecting the diversity of our neighborhood. And that really shaped who we became as a church. We also went through some real struggles. When we came to the church, I want to say it was very dysfunctional. My spouse said to me, "Tim, you can come here if you want. I'm going back to our old church." After the first week, it was just a kind of a really disastrous Sunday morning, and there were some serious dysfunctions to work through. We were making a lot of connections with Spanish-speaking folk, and we had hired a couple people to help us with that. The days of when a lot of Central American refugees were still coming. And we hired a guy from Mexico after a woman from Venezuela had been leading with us. And he didn't integrate into the life of the community as well as the woman from Venezuela. And he eventually took half the Spanish speakers to form a Spanish speaking church. And we realized in retrospect, that was largely our fault. We didn't do a good job integrating Renee into this vision of integration that we were working at. And so that really helped us. After that, we became much more multicultural, intercultural. We had at one point, we had people from 34 different countries that were part of the church in the early 2000s. The neighborhood's gentrified since then and become more Caucasian, and it feels like a loss in many ways for many of us. But we worked through those. We had another person who was a good leader, but sort of a solo player, and she ended up leaving. We worked through that well, though, and she's flourishing in another place. But we had to work through these dysfunctions. And when I was doing my doctoral thesis, I came across a study by a guy named Israel Galindo, and he said, on average, it takes 10 years for a church to move from a static place, to a place of renewal. When I read that, I was 40 years old. I thought, like, 10 years, man, that's a long time. And then I looked at what he described during those 10 years, and it was like a description of what had gone on at Grandview. And I realized, okay, this takes time, and it takes incremental movements with a theological vision and a practice of ministry that is slowly going to form us see God form us into a new kind of people. And that's exactly what happened. It took time. I also want to say a word about the older adults, particularly since I'm getting into that age group now myself. But the older adults in our community were a great gift in this transition, and because they had what I call a healthy institutional mindset. Like they wanted the institution to flourish, they wanted the people to flourish, but they weren't sure how to do it. But they chipped in wherever they could. This parents group, the child care was taken over by much more competent people than me, many older women and then one guy, and they loved these women. They loved them, and the men that were part of that group too. They loved the parents that were part of that group, and there were some situations they couldn't make a lot of sense of. There was a woman who gave birth for her sister, and they loved both the women and cared for them and celebrated the life of the baby. They just entered in and loved these people well. The second thing was that we had some older adults that were part of our church that had a lot of credibility from their leadership in our denomination and so forth. And people would say, well, I'm not sure what Tim's doing, but Howard and Shirley think it's a good idea, so I guess it's okay. And they really helped everybody in these times of transition to accept that there was going to be a lot of change. No senior left our church in this transition, and I look back at that with some sense of gladness about that, because there's a way to do this together as communities where we transition together to the future that God has. There was significant change in the life of the church in those first 10 years, but we traveled it together. And I officiated at the memorials of all of those seniors. Okay, so that's kind of the first 10 years of our journey. Let me tell you about the next 10 years. We started at this point, we were growing. We probably about 120 people by the year 2000. We were starting to get a diversity of people. Our leadership was becoming much more diverse ethnically, culturally, in all sorts of ways. And we were starting to dream about ways that we could care for our neighborhood together. And so let me tell you some of the stories of how things developed in the life of our community. First one is out of the cold. I know out of the colds in Toronto, people have meals and shelter here in Montreal, similarly. I was at a neighborhood meeting, Grandview Woodlands Area Services Team. So it's a monthly gathering of health, education, social service professionals. And they were, people were suspicious of a Baptist pastor. I mean, I would have been too if I were them, so I don't blame them. Coming to this group, and but somebody said to me about 5 years in, Tim, what are the churches doing for the increasing number of homeless people on Commercial Drive? And I said, nothing that I'm aware of. And so I went back to our church that Sunday. I told that story on Sunday morning, said, if you're interested in talking about this, let's gather after worship and talk about it. And so 15 people came. And it started with a conversation, which everything in our church starts with a lot of conversations. You can't get away without a lot of conversations to create things. And we did some research. We decided that we would bring a proposal to the church. And so 6 months later, we brought a proposal. We started out of the cold. Thursday night meal. People come, stay overnight during the colder months of the year, breakfast the next morning. Other things started happening on that Thursday night as well. That was a really important start for us because it was what sociologists refer to as one of those third spaces, not private, not public, somewhere in between, where people can meet each other and build trusting relationships together. From there, we developed a drop-in center on just a few doors down from the church where we had a chance to develop those relationships further. We had a counselor, we had an art room, computers, clothing, make some food, whatnot. And that was a way of developing that relationship together. We also started Salisbury Community Society and this idea of sharing life together in a home or in proximity to one another. Our family, well, let me tell you how that story started too. We were looking at buying a senior's home that was being sold just 5 blocks north of the church where we did monthly services there. And there was a family in our church that had a foundation that was willing to invest in a home, a housing, and they were looking at buying this place. We found out though if it was going to be sold that it was going to go through a change of use at City Hall, which would require seismic upgrading of this building. So we used to say they didn't mind if it fell down on seniors, but they didn't want it falling down on younger people. And of course, that was, if you're in urban planning, it's never that simple. But that wasn't viable anymore to do that. And so we kind of felt like, oh, the dream is dead. And then Charles and Rita Ringman became part of our community. They'd started Teen Challenge in Australia years ago. They lived in slums in Manila, and Charles was teaching at Regent College at the time. And they became part of our church, and they shared this vision of forming community in homes and in homes that were in proximity to each other. And so we took the 2 houses that the church owns. Maybe I don't have that picture. Oops, there we go. We took this house that was next door to the church that we were living in. We moved the block away from the church, and those 2 houses and 2 others became our first kind of community houses. Those dots on that house actually were painted one night when we were living in that house. Nobody's ever owned up to that. So I still want to find out who painted those dots, but they remain to this day on the church, on that building. In these homes, people lived together and would invite others to live with them who were 1 or 2 others who were more vulnerable, whether it was, somebody dealing with physical or emotional challenges, maybe somebody dealing with addiction, just some way, places where people that were more vulnerable, 1 or 2 of them could move in and share life with this group of people that were sharing in the home together. Our own family embarked on this journey. It all started by accident. Before this, we were living in this house, and a couple lived with us that were working with our Spanish-speaking folk, and they had a baby, and we shared life together, and they lived with us for 1.5 years, and then they finished their degrees and went back to South America. And then we had a woman mutual friend put us together. She was going through a divorce, depression. She needed a place to stay for a weekend. She stayed for 1.5 years. And then there was a single mother who had a young son who had a bad landlord, and she needed a place to stay for a week. He would barge into her apartment unannounced, and so we gave her refuge for 2 weeks, and she stayed for 1.5 years. So you can start to see what's going on here. So we sometimes joke that people live with us for 1.5 years. They find out what we're really like, and then they move out. It's not that simple, but it is. There's something there. In fact, when new people would move in, I would often say to them, the first 6 months or so, you're going to think, oh, the Dickows are pretty cool people. We enjoy living with them. And the next 6 months, you're going to think, the Dickows are the worst people we've ever met in this world. Like the things they do and the problems they cause are really challenging. And then we're going to have an opportunity to learn to love each other as we truly are, to be known by each other. And that's the journey that our community living, we've lived with, I think, 37 people over the last 30 some years. And it's been part of our life, just sharing life in that way. Many people, there's been about 16 houses at one point we had at Grandview where people were living in community and sharing life with each other. Many number of people moved right next door to each other so that they could develop a shared life in a place. We had pockets, neighborhood pockets, where there's just little, very local life that was flourishing in those ways, where people would meet for rhythms of prayer and welcome their neighbors into kind of the examine on a Thursday night sort of thing, and just becoming more porous, not only a thicker shared life, but more porous. And I'm going to say more about that as we move along. Let me say a word about Kinbrace. This is another initiative that grew out of the life of the church, where Kinbrace is 2 houses side by side, where refugee claimants, people who are making a refugee claim at the border, can come and stay, and they're helped through the refugee process. Kinbrace has welcomed over 450 refugee claimants over the last 20 years and become a significant part of our community. My co-pastor Tama, her and her husband Lauren grew up in East Africa. They started Kinbrace and had a passion to, they knew the stories themselves of people who had to flee East Africa as refugees. And so they wanted us to be able to provide a place of welcome. And that really shaped the life of the church too. Emmanuel Ndabarishimana came as a refugee to Kinbrace from Burundi. He was Hutu, his wife was Tutsi. They were forming an integrated church there. And his wife, he was shot at a number of times and fled for safety. He became a pastor of our morning congregation. We developed a second congregation partway through our journey. And Emmanuel, just so significant. He then, after 5 years, we sent him back to Burundi, where he was involved in national leadership, but just tragically was killed, murdered just 6 months ago by some, in his own speaking up of corruption in Burundi. So Kinbrace really shaped our lives together too. Just two other things I want to tell you about, and then we'll stop and we'll start talking together. Cohere is a building that is 26 units built over top of our parking lot. This came out of our second visioning process, where we were asking the question, what do we do with this parking lot that we have? We bought a house next door to it as well, and that ended up being torn down. We had a community garden. We said, what can we do with this underutilized land in an urban context? Then we began to dream about housing. We eventually developed the foundation that oversaw the development of that. And that has about 45 people living in it, all a single or bachelor, 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom suites. They are all independent units, but we also were able to structure the architecture in a way that fostered community. So the first floor is all community space, community kitchen, dining room, some guest rooms, some offices, and the gardens outside. And then each of the 5 rooms opens up into a common living room, which has really been beautiful. You know, you imagine you have little kids and you can just step out into that living room and see some other adults without getting a babysitter and so forth. And so it's really fostered a sense of well-being together. We believe churches need to be thinking about how, especially in urban, but often even in suburban and rural contexts, about how to utilize our land assets in better ways. So many of them are underutilized for the good of the community. And I know some of you know Graham Singh, and Graham's really thinking a lot about this with Trinity Centers, and others are across the country. In fact, I've been trying to pull together a national conversation around this really important topic of how do we deal with land and properties. Just Work. Just Work developed when we had a lot of people that were unemployed or underemployed, and we were trying to think about how do we support those folks. And we started a little committee. Eventually, we got a woman coming back to our church from New Zealand, had a master's degree in community economic development. We got her $2,000 to do a study one summer, and she interviewed people who were underemployed, looked at responses, presented her report to our people from our church, and we started Just Work. And Just Work now focuses on developing social enterprises, businesses with a social mandate, social vision to offer employment for people with barriers to employment. Just Work now employs about 37 people, generating about $250,000 in wages. Many of them are on disability. And so not only significant income that folks get, but meaningful work, which we're all created for, right? And so there's a real goodness in that. What? Oops. Oh, there is one more. East Side Story Guild, our Sunday school wasn't happening about after 5 years. Our kids were about the only kids around, and so we needed to figure out something else. And so at the same time, the arts funding in the neighborhood, in local schools, was declining on East Side schools. And we wondered, well, how can we, address that somehow? And so we developed the East Side Story Guild, where children develop art skills, whether it's dance, drama, so forth. And They then learn the stories of the Bible, and they themselves figure out how to tell these stories creatively with help from adults and teenagers to the congregation. This is the most kind of evangelistic thing that we've done, in the sense that half of the kids in this program are from non-church families, but they really value the arts. And so they want their kids to be involved in this Friday afternoon program because they know they're going to learn the arts. So one of the stories, so Shad, if you know Shad, he with CBC performed rap artist. Shad was part of our church for 5 years, and he lived in one of these community houses. And Shad taught the kids hip hop, and they told the story of Jacob and Esau through the hip hop. And Shad was standing at the back, all smiles, never seeing this happy, and the just really beautiful storytelling. And so this really shaped not only our community's understanding of the experience of these stories, but shaped these kids' lives in a way that brought them into the Christian story in a really significant way. Okay, I've talked far too long. Sorry, I didn't intend to talk quite that long, but any questions, just things that you're kind of interested to hear a couple more sentences about, or questions that you have? Yeah, a very legitimate question. Question is, how were all these initiatives funded? We really benefited from having this family that had a foundation that helped us get going on a lot of these things. And so they would say to us, this couple said, Tim, we've got some money to help with some of these things. When there is people and when there is vision, we will give money, but we won't give too much. We'll just give a little bit to get started, and then let's see if it develops. They were beautiful people. They knew how to give money without control. That's a gift, isn't it? And they just wanted to see things develop and flourish. And so that really helped us get going. My experience, though, is with all these initiatives, if there are people and vision, and it really makes a difference in our neighborhoods, money will follow. If we try and get money first, get all the money first, it's probably not going to happen. But we need to take risks and it's people, vision, and changing our neighborhood that people want to invest in. Yep.
Hold on just a sec. Wait. Use the microphone.
Just wondering if it, pardon me, I'm just wondering if it was a parish member that owned the apartment, it looks like, for refugees that were awaiting processing.
No, it was this same family that we bought the first house that had 10 units. And that was the initial house that was offered for refugee claimants. So again, this family had a significant role there. But when we bought the house, we really debated because it was $500,000. Well, now that house is valued at $3.5 million. And so just the crazy gentrification has really been nuts.
This may be a little bit of an impolite question. I really appreciate the story and the journey of your church, and I've heard parish or stories like that in many parts of the country, in many denominations.
Yep.
But the question we were supposed to be dealing with today was, what's next? We heard lots about what happened 20 years ago and 10 years ago, and also ministry in a pandemic-shaped world. I'd really like to hear how the pandemic has impacted all of what you're doing and how you have shifted.
Yep. Well, I wisely left 3 months before the pandemic started. So I can tell you a little bit about the churches had to do what everybody's done, figure out how to care for each other and be the church when you couldn't meet in person. I think that one of the, again, to go back to, I think COVID in my mind has exposed and accelerated the demise of Christendom models of church, and exposed their weaknesses and accelerated the sense that we can't just keep doing this the way we've done it, right? And so I think the future of the church is going to look more incarnational, ironically, after the pandemic. It's going to be more local, and it's going to be more experimental, and it's going to be more this. What I think is a way forward is we need to develop a thicker shared life with each other, because formation is important. So it doesn't have to be community living. It doesn't have to be in geographic proximity to each other. You're going to have to work this out in different ways, in different contexts. We would tell people when they came to our church, the gospel calls us to a deeper shared life than our culture envisions. You're going to have to work that out. We're here to help you. We've got some ways we're working at this. We'll help you with that. But you need to develop a thicker shared life, because that's where we're developing these common practices of hospitality and engaging in prayer and so forth. Because these are ways that we're going to be formed in Christ ourselves to resist these powers of autonomy and consumerism and so forth. So I think that's part of the future of the church. We're going to have to develop that thicker shared life. But it can't be the old model or an older model of us versus them. Those days are over too. Like, it's got to be us widening us, right? There has to be a porosity to this kind of future where we're engaged as the church with people, and people of diversity of every kind. There's got to be room in the church for everyone. And so how do we make sure that we're really loving individual neighbors and making sure that the church has room for all of those? These stories are stories of how we try to work at that kind of vision. And I think that is what somehow has to be worked out in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I appreciate that answer to what is a pertinent question. Your examples are super encouraging, and to see so much good out of a community is inspiring. Whether we're talking pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, we all should be looking at this and thinking, okay, what were the things at play that we've heard? What's our own context, and how can we do similar things when we see good witness in front of us? So my question is very simple, and you may have said this. If so, I apologize. How big was your church when you were doing all this? Because it seems like often I hear these kinds of things, and as soon as I hear that the church wasn't 1,000 members, it's just like, it's actually the smaller churches often that I find are doing some of the most inspirational things.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tim, for that question. Yeah, we were a church. When I left, we were about 300 people. And in 2004, we intentionally developed a second congregation within our own church building, because there were so few churches in the neighborhood. In fact, when I had come there, I'd found out that 20 churches had disappeared over the last 30 years from the landscape, and that we needed more churches in that place. So we started a second congregation, and together we had about 300 people. So, we were not a large church. I mean, it was a healthy church, but it wasn't a large church. Everybody participated, and people who just wanted to sit in pews in a church tended not to be a part of Grandview, because I think they thought, oh, I'm not really doing what everybody else is doing here, because everybody found ways to contribute. At the same time, we had a number of people whose primary vocation was in their workplace, and we did quite a bit we did 4 series in my time there about faith and work, interviewing people about how to work out the kingdom of God in their vocation. And so we worked at that too, but it was not a large church. I think, again, the thing I always remind people, this is 30 years, right? 10 years of experimenting and getting healthy, 10 years of really now knowing our neighborhood and engaging in our neighborhood in a significant way. 10 years, in the last 10 years, where we really started to push into wider systemic issues, reconciliation with First Nations, climate change. We started to push into these areas with other groups, and that systemic impact came out of this long journey of engaging our neighbors in those ways. And so I think there's some learning there too, that we often, we make often like 2-year plans, and that's kind of our church vision for the future, sort of thing. And I think we need to learn from the Benedictines and the other monastic communities. I did my retreat at Guelph a while back, and they have a 500-year plan for their land around their monastery. I don't know any church that has a 500-year plan. So we need to be thinking longer term about developing the kinds of communities that can be effective for the world, for God.
We're just coming close to time for a break, but is there any other questions for Tim before we pause for a moment? No, yes, okay, we'll come around.
Thanks. You refer to yourself as a pastor in a church. I think you're a miracle worker. It's not a question. No, it isn't. The question
I
is,
say that I just to say that that's not true. And to be quite honest, I burned out at the end. I was drinking too much. Like I needed a break. And like there's brokenness in these stories. This is not all like goodness and light. And we worked through a number of difficult issues. But the good news is that grace was greater than our sin. And I really want to say that it's important to have that perspective in all these journeys that I hear.
the question is, this is Quebec where governments want to control everything. You got into things that are handled normally by social service and so on and so on and so on. To what extent did you have problems getting permission to do some of the stuff that you've done?
That's a great question. We, like all of you, you know, lots of people in government and business are very suspicious of the church, and with good reasons sometimes, right? And so we had to demonstrate credibility over time that we were committed to people's well-being. And people started to see that and appreciate that. This Grandview Woodlands Services team that I mentioned, like people were really suspicious of me. 10 years into it, I became the chairperson because there was a trust with our church that we were good. In my 22nd year, I was invited to speak to 200 civic employees about how the church could collaborate with the city could collaborate with the church. But that came out of this long history of people seeing that we were committed to people's well-being. And I think we need to do that as churches if we want to have a public voice. We need to be demonstrating that we're committed to the common good. Then we can have a seat at the table, and people will want to work with us because they see that you're doing good that maybe we can't do easily in the public sector.
All right, real quick. Okay, all right, good. Everybody, thanks you. Let's take a break. It is just 11 o'clock right now. I think when we come back, you can see while you're taking a break, have a look at these 4 papers around the walls here, and Tim will guide us there. I'll say we'll take a break for 10 minutes, which really means we'll take a break for 13, which hopefully won't be 15. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Yes.